Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 130 of Humanity Rising. Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and now over 350 partnering organizations from all over the world. We instigated and catalyzed this initiative in the depths of the pandemic back in April. 6 months ago, and we had our first session on May 22nd. And since then, we've had daily broadcasts ranging from 15 to 20,000 people as people from all over the world have come together in essentially a global commons to share their experiences of what it's like navigating through this extraordinary event in human history that has brought the world to a standstill and currently shows no sign of letting up. And to take counsel together as to, what's happening, how can we respond effectively enough so that we can actually make a difference as the world traverses through this pandemic and begins to give shape to a post-pandemic future. One of the advantages, I would say, of Humanity Rising is that we decided not to do what is typically done. And that is, you convene a summit and it's generally for one day or a weekend or maybe 5 days, 7 days, and then it's over. But we made the decision that since we were in a pandemic, that we should continue as long as the pandemic unfolded. Not knowing when we started whether this was going to last a couple of weeks and then the pandemic was going to kind of go the way of SARS and the bird flu and so forth and so on, urgent and then kind of disappears. And so as events have unfolded, Humanity Rising has been here. And today demarcates probably the most consequential moment for the world, I would say, since the pandemic began. And that is the election in the United States, where Donald Trump is seeking another 4 years of the presidency. And there's been very, I would say, nefarious activities swirling around as to whether it was going to be free, whether it was going to be fair, whether the outcome was being manipulated in some way. So I would say coming into today, the world has been holding its breath, unsure whether the longest continuous democracy in history was going to survive this election. So we have dedicated this entire week to the consequences that are now unfolding as the democratic institutions sculpted over 2.5 centuries now labor under some attacks and subterfuge for which most of us were not prepared. Yesterday, we began to delve into the history and the context for the election. And starting today, we'll have commentators that have a lot to say, that are deeply wise about the circumstances facing humanity at this critical time. We'll get that going in just a minute, but we'd like to start with probably the most important thing we can all do, given the tensions and the unknowingness facing us all at the moment, is just spend a minute and take a few deep breaths and close your eyes and place your attention on your heart. And for the next minute, just listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude that you're alive at this moment. And if you can, as you listen to your own heartbeat, be aware of the heartbeat of all the people on this call and all the people of goodwill around the world. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart, I want to welcome all of you to this program. And we're going to begin each day, as I indicated yesterday, with Shelly Alcorn, who closely studies US politics and society, by just giving us an update on what's happening. And then we'll commence our program with Charles Eisenstein and Vandana Shiva. Shelly?
Oh, good morning, everyone, from the Ubiquity University News Desk. I guess is what we'll refer to this as. My job for the next few days is to bring you news that we're attempting to put into context for you as we move through the election process in the United States. And one thing I wanted to say before I started, I did hear that I had been invited to the after chat yesterday, and I'm so sorry I wasn't able to be there because of a meeting. So if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to email me at my Ubiquity University email address, or get in contact with me somehow. Would love to share any additional information with you that I can. I didn't mean to ignore the invitation. I just wasn't able to attend. So it seems odd that we're here on Election Day in 2020. Seems like a lifetime has passed since 2016. But we are here at the moment that we have been waiting for a number of years. And the first thing I want to start out with is just, please, everybody breathe, everybody stay focused. And then I'm going to say that it feels, the energy feels breathless inside the United States right now. And we really need to breathe. And focus on what we're about to experience. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected by losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College. And I want to remind everyone that it is very possible that he will do that again this year. This is not out of the realm of possibility. Regardless of the voter enthusiasm and turnout the vote, there is still a path to victory for Donald Trump. We are hoping for a landslide vote for Joe Biden. But as we discussed yesterday, it's going to come down to a number of battleground states that they refer to. And just for an example, in Florida, their absentee ballots have been coming in by the thousands and thousands, and several million, in fact. And the Democratic return versus the Republican registered return is only 100,000 votes ahead at this moment in Florida. There are non-party affiliated voters who are voting as well, which may bode well for the Biden campaign, but we don't know that. So as you're watching election returns coming in over the next few days, what we're really looking for is Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Ohio to show whether or not Trump will have a path to victory in this election. It may very well be that Pennsylvania comes down to be 2000s Florida. The Bush v. Gore came down to Florida. It may well be that 2020 Biden and Trump may come down to Pennsylvania. So with that being said, there's a lot of voter enthusiasm out there, a lot of people going to vote for Biden and for Harris, and we absolutely hope that they will prevail, and that would be a good message for the people of the United States to send to the rest of the world. As we talked about yesterday, we're sort of breaking our news down into a number of different buckets, which is sort of the overall strategy that's been put in place that we need to prepare ourselves to deal with. We had some good news overnight. Yesterday, I talked about delegitimizing the vote, these sort of constant refrains. The news reports you're seeing all of a sudden breaking this morning about voting machines not working and other things like that, that is normal and expected. You cannot have an election in a country this size without having some voting machines go down and some kerfuffle happen in terms of administration. So please don't be alarmed by those reports. Those are to be expected. But we talked yesterday about this concerted effort to throw out 127,000 ballots in Texas. It turns out that the federal judge had ruled to keep those votes in. The Republicans appealed to the Fifth Circuit, federal. The Fifth Circuit also said those votes will count. Now the Republican Party is asking the full Fifth Circuit panel of federal judges to look at the case. So it's not over in Texas, but it's continuing to look very good that those votes in Texas will be counted. So just so you know, there are lots of wins happening as well, and that's important for us to keep in mind. Over 100 million ballots have already been cast in the United States election before the polls open today. That's more than 47% of registered voters nationwide, which is pretty amazing, and 73% of the entire number of ballots cast in this 2016 election. So this is going to be an absolutely record-breaking year, and I think that is really, really terrific, really terrific. So let's talk about sort of different intimidation tactics. We haven't seen a lot of those today, so we'll continue. We'll continue to hope for that. There are some worrying signs in Michigan, Michigan being the state where the governor was threatened. Michigan had decided to attempt to curtail open carry. What open carry is it is the United States citizen carrying a firearm in their hands or on their body. The Michigan Supreme Court punted on making the decision, and they didn't rule on open carry at election poll sites in time for the election. So today, their Michigan citizens will, if they would like to open carry a gun into the election offices, they can. I am disappointed in the Michigan State Supreme Court for not ruling on that issue. I mentioned yesterday Bill Barr and the Department of Justice. We've sort of been wondering what they're up to. He's been awfully quiet and off the radar. It turns out we now have news reports that personnel from the Justice Department's Bureau of Prisons, 110 agents there who specialize in putting down prison riots, have been put on alert to be deployed to Washington, D.C. or other places in case of election violence. The U.S. Marshals, ICE, and CBP also alert to travel to DC or other locations. The FBI, in contrast, is being very neutral. They're monitoring and actively responding to any complaints, any complaints or any electoral illegality, and helping the voters. So that is a very good sign. And so we'll continue to hope for peace and a peaceful process to happen today. Just for humor's sake, if we want to we're trying to keep this light, trying to breathe a little bit. Waymo, actually, in San Francisco, has moved all of its self-driving cars to a secure location in case of election night chaos in San Francisco. So I just thought that was kind of cute that all the self-driving cars are like driving themselves off into a corner. So let's just go there. There are no reports yet on Electoral College because that's not going to come into effect until votes and certification and whatnot and so on. So we don't have any updates to give you on anything like that. In terms of incendiary rhetoric, that has not stopped. Trump continues to use these types of words and sayings. He actually is blasting the United States Supreme Court on a Pennsylvania decision that they just released. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about what that decision is and why I think Pennsylvania could potentially be this year's Florida. Saying on Twitter he believes the Supreme Court decision will incite violence in the streets. He's continuing to sort of give this okay to this sort of thing. At one of his last rallies, he also talked about physically assaulting Joe Biden. This is something that they have both engaged in, which I don't approve of over the past few months, but sort of his last out was, those legs have gotten way thin, I wouldn't even have to make a fist. And it's not that Trump says those things necessarily. That was said at a rally in Florida, because we're kind of used to that from them. It was disturbing to see the video of the crowd then chanting "kick his ass" as Trump was talking about that. So there is still that fervor on the part of those rally goers. So the center in the fight right now is Pennsylvania, and I want to talk a little bit about that. The Supreme Court of the United States deadlocked 4-4 a few days ago, with John Roberts joining Kagan and the other more liberal justices on the issue of how long Pennsylvania could receive ballots after the election. We talked yesterday, many states have many different rules. It's very hard. The election system in the United States is extremely complex because every state kind of sets its own rules. They have general guidelines, but it's very messy. They're really focused on Pennsylvania right now. And what they wanted to say was that ballots had to be received by 8 p.m. today, or they would be invalid. That was the suit. SCOTUS deadlocked on that 4-4. Judge Amy Coney Barrett recused herself from that one, I believe, but she was not involved in that one. They have ordered Pennsylvania to segregate those ballots that come in past 8 p.m. today and through 3 days afterwards, through 5 p.m., and segregate those ballots for a future potential Supreme Court ruling on the admissibility of those ballots. So, in fine fashion, the Republican Party has launched their first lawsuit in Pennsylvania this morning for an additional number of ballots that they want to exclude. So we need to continue watching. If Pennsylvania becomes very, very close, the United States Supreme Court may decide to revisit that decision on the admissibility of Pennsylvania ballots. And that's one race we're going to be watching very closely. So, okay, so that's where we are. It seems momentous. It seems ironic that tomorrow is the day that the United States officially leaves the Paris Climate Agreement. We do hope for a different outcome on the part of the United States and the world. The 5 positives I'd like to leave you with is still from Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. We're going through his 20 hints. And here's what we can do to stay positive. Defend institutions. So let's defend our institutions. Let's help our election boards. Let's help each other get through this. Take responsibility for the face of the world. If you see symbols being used, if you see things happening, take responsibility for what you see in the streets. Stand out. Stand out. Use your voice. Be kind to our language. Avoid using other phrases that everybody uses, and think for yourself. And then believe in truth. To abandon fact is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, no one can criticize power. There's no basis on which to do so. If nothing's true, all is spectacle, and the biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. So we're here. We're going to see what happens today. We appreciate you all being here and all staying close and supporting the good outcomes that we're hoping for to see in the United States this week. So thank you, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, Shelly. And Shelly will be back tomorrow. There will be a lot more news in 24 hours, rest assured. So now I want to welcome Charles Eisenstein and Vandana Shiva. You all know them. Charles, you remember, wrote that very well-received, now famous essay called The Coronation that began to circulate globally quite soon after the pandemic had descended, and people were wondering what on earth had just hit us. He's written a number of books, including the book Sacred Economics, and has been writing on human affairs and civilization, ecology, and the human future for a number of years. One of the great, I would say, public intellectuals in the United States. Vandana Shiva from India, all of you know, she's written over 20 books. She has the distinction of being one of the few people anywhere that has looked Monsanto in the eye, and Monsanto blinked. And she succeeded in expelling them from India, and has been, as many of you know, on the forefront of the International Forum on Globalization and the worldwide discussion about globalization, both in terms of the reality of an increasingly interconnected world and the toxicity of corporations ruling that world for profit at the expense of communities and the ecology. So we thought on this day of the election, Charles and Vandana would be perfect to just give us first, I think starting with you, Charles, and then you, Vandana, just what's your sense of the US election? What do you see? Do you have any feelings, any concerns, any questions? How are you viewing what is at stake in the US election? Charles?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jim. And really happy to be here with you and with Vandana. In a way, I'm sure that neither of us are the right person to ask this kind of question if the focus is specifically on the mechanics of the election itself. I'm really, all this stuff about Pennsylvania and Michigan, and I've kind of heard that going on in the background, but I don't really have very much to contribute to the conversation on that level. And I would actually question the framing of this whole, this momentous moment, this the most important thing happening for humanity that's going to determine our future. I think that it is symptomatic of deeper processes. And, you know, an analogy I've been using is imagine that you're living in a big prison and the warden says, okay, it's time for democracy. And you get to vote on the prison mascot. And one of the prison mascots is maybe a lot better, you think, than the other one. And it's really important that we elect this mascot rather than that mascot. And maybe the mascot even has a little bit of power. And so all of the energy goes toward this mascot election in the prison, leaving untouched the fact that you're in a prison and that the real power is held by the warden and the prison administration, and translating that into now this is a distilled and over extreme version of what we are experiencing right now, but to a huge degree, the actual locus of power is pretty much untouched and invisible in this election, partly because of the way that the entire electoral process and our entire democracy, so-called, is set up. The subversion of democracy is so much deeper and bigger than the machinations of the Republicans. And by the way, if we had a Republican sympathizer on this program, they would be saying similar things that Shelly was saying about the Democrats and offering an entire analysis that is uncannily parallel to the Democratic analysis. So basically, one of the things, so the global imperialistic war machine, the neoliberal colonial program that's operating around the world, the power of big tech, big pharma, big ag, all of the corporate NGO industrial complex, the systemic maintenance of growing inequality of wealth, the continued extraction and exploitation of nature, like all of these things. I'm not saying there's no difference between the two parties. I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump, but the way that the election, or let's even not just say election, the way that power is transferred and where real power lies does not hinge upon this election. And even if we remove Donald Trump, the conditions of which Donald Trump is a symptom are still there. Part of those conditions is the profound disaffection with and alienation from established institutions in this society, for good reason. Anyway, I don't want to go on too far because I'm really curious what Vandana has to say about this, and I'd actually prefer to kind of piggyback on her view from a non-US citizen. Things look a lot different from other places on Earth. Things that look so huge and so consumingly important from our perspective. I'd like to hear Vandana's perspective from the outside.
Vandana.
You're on
Thank
mute.
you, Carol.
So, just a few hours ago, I was in a session of the Earth University, like your ubiquitous university. I started about 20 years ago because of Satish Kumar's inspiration to create a Schumacher College-like institution in India. And we call it the Bij Vidyapeeth, the School of the Seed, or the Earth University. And the course is on Gandhi and globalization. We've been teaching it for 20 years. And with Gandhi and democracy, you have to take 100 years time frame. And the beauty, of course, of Gandhi is he defined Swaraj, self-governance, self-rule, and limitations of state power, higher responsibility and higher powers at the level of people in a decentralized system through participation. That is the debate that was growing. And in fact, you mentioned, Jim, been part of IFG, and I want to send love to Jerry, who's been ill in hospital right now, the founder of International Forum on Globalization. And 1999, True Democracy was on the streets of Seattle. We stopped the single biggest institution that was being created for corporate rule. It was called the Constitution for the Future. And it's still in intensive care, never got out. WTO did not get out of that democratic response, of the questioning of corporate power and the trampling of people's rights and the environment. And I remember so well that the Turtles and the Teamsters were marching together, even though it was always said the trade unions and the environmentalists are each other's enemies. But no, when it comes to our common good and the common rights, we were all together. And I want to read out a para from my book, Earth Democracy, that I wrote after Seattle, because in a way, it is also my perspective on the elections now. So 99 was Seattle. By 2004, the debate of democracy had shifted in the United States. It used to be the case that the Democrats were for workers and about the economy, and the Republicans were about the rich. And then it became about culture. And this is what I wrote in Earth Democracy. The reduction of the 2004 US election to red and blue belts, not over economic philosophy, not over political philosophy, but over conflicts over so-called cultural values, are examples of the destruction of diversity and pluralism through the construction of negative exclusivist identities. And this was also, remember the Iraq War, and remember Samuel Huntington talking about the clash of civilizations, and he had written, "You cannot know who you are till you know who you hate." And in effect, that my existence depends on your annihilation. This was done at the global scale. But this has totally seeped into the electoral discourse. And when I watch and say, shouldn't we be discussing how we got to this place through corporate globalization? Shouldn't we be discussing the kind of future economies we want, given, as Charles has just said, we've got 5 robber barons of our time who have walked away with $670 billion during our lockdown, while people lost work, economies were shut, and they're looking at total control. I've done about 3 books in the meantime on the future they're creating and the future we need for humanity rising. Just done a book on the future of food and health and humanity, with a patent of Google or Microsoft on one side and deep Indian Ayurvedic science on the other side. What's the body? What is food? What is the self? What is being human? And because of the way we've been emptied out, first we were emptied out materially with the outsourcing. And in fact, if you look at the Trump base, it is the disenfranchised workers through the outsourcing of globalization. And I remember during the WTO debates, it was the corporations of America who wanted China in there because their profits would increase with the outsourcing. I've written a lot and thought a lot about the fact that we talk about authoritarian leaders as if they're little atoms that came out of the blue. we forget that corporate rule and corporate globalization meant huge amounts of power in the hands of corporations and the billionaires, who then play the divide and rule game. They've been doing it in India since British rule, where they split us into Pakistan and India, and that Muslim-Hindu issue is still in the elections. There'll be our elections going on, and it's all about kill, 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 hate, hate, hate. That divide and rule policy has been used to divert our attention from the daily issues of our life and livelihoods, of our freedom and democracy. And the fears and insecurity of a dismembered economy are then fed on, and add to it the layer of big tech and social media and the way they can manufacture what you think, how you think, while they mine your data, and have turned us into data mines. I just remember 2016. Everyone's talking about the electoral college and the popular vote. People have forgotten that Facebook sold personal data. Cambridge Analytica took algorithms on 4 hates. Because, when we are talking and we think of love and we meditate, it is our inner experience. But if I have to create a negative identity, I have to do it along axis of hate. And the 4 hate algorithms that Cambridge Analytica fed were hate of women, hate of Blacks, hate of Muslims, and hate of migrants. And as a Newsweek article said, it's the first time we have an artificial intelligence president. But all authoritarian rulers are actually puppets of those who manage it, because what they need are people who will be authoritarian over the public and instruments of big money. And it's that dual role, I call it the inverted state. If democracy mutates under globalization from being of the people, by the people, for the people, into of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations, or of the billionaires, for the billionaires, by the billionaires, then what we call authoritarians are their puppets. And instead of regulating big money, they start over-regulating and over-policing and surveillance system. So what we are seeing is we are on the verge of a militarized corporate surveillance state, which has absolutely no welfare in mind, which has no compassion in mind, which has no accountability in mind. And that's why the deeper debate on democracy for the period in between elections is also important. How do we govern ourselves between one vote and 4 years later? And how do we connect how Trump came to power in 2016 to what globalization did? And start thinking of what are the economies we want, because that is where democracy will be decided.
Charles, what's your comment on
I just love the force and precision with which Vandana states the case. I'll just add a little bit that the most important issues at stake right now are not even being talked about in the election. And Vandana mentioned some of them, like the corporate control of the public mind, the hijacking of narratives, the information warfare, the categorizing of anything that violates established interests as disinformation or misinformation, and the censorship of that. This is not going to end if Joe Biden wins the election. In fact, many of those corporate interests and powers are trying to ensure that Joe Biden does get elected. And in fact, the establishment, both Democrat and Republican, have fully supported most of the worst things that Donald Trump has been doing. And even in many cases, the Democratic Party thinking he has not gone far enough or done it effectively enough. For example, in igniting, is that the right word? Launching a new Cold War with Russia, the containment and demonization of China, Iran, et cetera, et cetera. There's been no whisper of complaint from the Democratic Party on Trump's illegal seizure of the Iranian tankers that were bringing much needed fuel to Venezuela. There was no whisper of opposition from the Democratic Party, or maybe a tiny bit on the very far left fringe of it, about the coup in Bolivia, which has been now reversed by people power, and a new socialist government is in place in Bolivia. This is a tremendous bright spot today. The juggernaut of corporate, government, financial power is not at stake in this election. It's not the question that's being asked. I was happy to hear Vandana mention Ayurveda. Like, here's another thing, another of the polarizing issues that separate the public into two warring sides, which then, as tools of war, incite hatred against the other, demonize the other, make the other seem so monstrous that you yourself are a monster if you question your own narrative. Because when winning becomes more important than truth, then we develop ways to filter out and control what we think of as truth. And this has happened on both sides, to the point where it's hard to even tell what is a fact. Like, I appreciated Shelly's invocation at the beginning, that we have to trust in something called truth. Otherwise, the blinding lights of whoever has the most money and power are going to mesmerize us. But how do you even know what's truth when information is controlled in order to fit a winning narrative and to generate hate against the other side? So anyway, so yeah, one of the truths that gets excluded from this highly polarized militant debate is, like, in the arena of COVID-19, things like Ayurveda, herbal medicine, Chinese medicine, homeopathy, the entire corpus of alternative medicine that had seemed to be the province of the left. It's like the hippies and the yoga people who are supposed to be into alternative medicine. Now, all of a sudden, that's become kind of right wing, because now you're going against science, and Trump goes against science, and so forth. Like, everything gets resolved into what is really an artificial split that obscures any truth that doesn't fit the dominant narrative. And this is what we are trapped in. And the spectacle of the election exacerbates this trend. So yeah, on one level, yes, this is a very important election, and represents I won't say it represents actually a choice of what direction we're going to head as a civilization, but I would say it represents our aspiration to be in choice. What we really want is true democracy, which is not offered in the current US electoral system. But our aspiration for that democracy is expressed through the only means that is apparently available to people, which is to vote in this election. That is not going to actually meet the need that seeks expression here, the need for real democracy, which depends on, it is not containable. Democracy is not containable within our current system. It's not made for democracy. It's undemocratic through and through. I mean, just look at the way that the candidates are selected. What happened to Bernie Sanders? What happened to all of the positions that are endorsed by a broad majority of the public, like universal health care and the amelioration of income inequality and peace and environmental protection? I mean, if you look beyond the polarizing issue of, is climate change caused by CO2 and et cetera, and like actually look at protecting our precious soils and waters and forests, there's not actually polarization on that, not very much. And I could go through issue by issue: prison reform, bringing the troops home. What the broad majority of people actually want is not even available as a political choice in the current system. So yeah, I don't think that this election is really about democracy. It is not insignificant, but let's not just focus on this election and then when it's over and just say Biden does win in a landslide and we breathe a sigh of relief. The problem is not solved. The conditions that give rise to fascism are still here, which is disenfranchisement, which is disconnection, which is powerlessness, despair. I've looked into, well, actually, you know, I think I'll stop right there because I've said enough for now, and I want to hand it back over. But yes, thank you.
I've got a couple of questions I'd love to ask, but this is so rich between the two of you. Vandana, do you have any comment that you want to make before we move on?
Oh, well, I'll only add that, you know, sitting in a country like India, where till globalization, the United States was very far away for our existence. And then basically the WTO rules were written by American corporations. Cargill wrote the agriculture rules, Monsanto wrote the intellectual property rules, and Pfizer and all the big pharma. And the junk food rules, I call them, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreements, were written by the Cokes and the Pepsis. And now, in effect, it's a very strange situation because globalization Americanized India, destroyed work, destroyed our food, destroyed our health. And of course, you must have seen our Prime Minister and Trump, both in America and India, very, very close. But when I look at it in terms of, will there be a big change if Biden comes? No, because it doesn't matter who's in White House. It is about arms sale. It is about getting agribusiness to come and destroy our small farmers. It is all the time about business, business, business. And sadly, for the rest of the world, it doesn't matter which party wins because they are overcommitted to big money and big corporations, both sides.
Good. These are very compelling perspectives, and I thank you. It's clear, you know, it's like Naomi Klein says in her most recent book, "No is not enough." You know, to really understand Trump, you need to understand that he's not an exception; he's a symptom. Mm-hmm. He's a consequence, not an effect. Yeah. And that at the root of it is, you know, in her coinage, you know, disaster capitalism, neoliberalism in all its multiple manifestations, as both of you have indicated. But let me ask you this. I think, you know, as the philosophers, you know, often ask, does history make the person or does person make history? You know, what I'm feeling from you is that it doesn't make any difference, Republican, Democrat. It's all controlled by the corporations. And I think to some degree that's true. But I would put into this discussion the point of view that people also make history. Mm-hmm. And that with Donald Trump, like with Adolf Hitler, just to take a recent example, occasionally someone comes along that shapes history in a particularly egregious way. And that therefore the election, in my view, does matter. 4 more years of Trump, particularly at the level of climate change and what we need to do with the ecology, given the fact that scientists are telling us that quite literally we're running out of time. It feels to me that while agreeing with you that, you know, we're caught in a very complex corporatization of governance, culture, and technology, absolutely. But isn't it equally true that an election does matter? If we elect Joe Biden, he may not be perfection, but at least he and Kamala Harris believe we should be part of the Paris Accord, and we need to work energetically on climate change. So what do you, each of you, believe in terms of whether, is it just history is the only thing that matters and it shapes us willy-nilly, or do individuals matter also, and do choices matter? Because the consequences of this election feel to me, just intuitively, to be of extraordinary impact on the United States, because for the first time in our history, we have a man in the Oval Office that has been doing the bidding of a foreign power and is now intent on subverting the democratic institutions that have undergirded the republic from the beginning. And that feels to me as if it matters. Now, maybe in your view it doesn't, but I just love your comment on this question of whether history makes the person, or is it equally true that the person makes history?
I'm not saying elections don't matter. Elections matter hugely. But I think it is extremely important to recognize that unless the people's choices and determination is strong and is not manipulated by a controlled media and a controlled social media system, then the real choices don't get made. Look at Bolivia. In spite of the coup, they've come back. Look at Chile. How many young people marched last winter, and yet they've managed to question and overturn the Constitution Pinochet rule. So I'm absolutely celebrating these people's victories. I definitely agree that the culture wars that were fabricated, sadly, they were fabricated by the Democrats at that time, because the Democrats were, it was Bill Clinton whom I had to deal with in Seattle, trying to make it look like the small handicrafts of India were all child labor and therefore they must shut down. I mean, totally beading making, they made it the big issue at that time. And I wrote a whole report on it because they wanted to distract from the questioning of the world's public in unison of so-called free trade, which, because we've been colonized, we see it as recolonization and a return of corporate rule, a return of deregulated commerce, a return of deregulation. So what you're saying about Trump walking away from Paris, I think we need to see that there are two internationals, right? There's a globalization based on corporate greed and deregulation. And there's an internationalism based on the UN system, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Desertification Treaty, the Oceans Treaty. We need an international body of laws both environmental protection and human rights. Human rights law came out of Hitler's Germany and all of the violence we had witnessed there. We can't support governments that dismantle that protection. It's just like our body, every cell has a membrane. Every organ has a membrane. My body has a membrane. Membranes are the regulatory systems of society, and they have to exist at multiple levels. And we are in a period of deregulation. And yes, you're looking at Paris, but if you look at the deregulation of big pharma and what they're trying to do right now, I don't see anyone questioning that deregulation or the deregulation of the billionaires' money making. That's why I keep saying we've got to turn to the economy. The economy is the driver of inequality. It is the driver of destruction of the planet. It is the driver of insecurity. And therefore, from the ground of insecurity, it fuels the polarization. And that polarization is further amplified. In physics, we have something called the Stern-Gallaert experiment. You have a huge magnetic force, and that then polarizes the spin of the quanta. We can't afford the level of polarization, and we definitely can't afford to ignore the unity builders. It's our common, Charles talked about our common home, our common environmental protection, our common right to education, common right to health and food. Look at the vulnerability on food, made worse during the lockdown. And so these things are missing. And yes, the cultural wars will be worse if there's a return of Trump to the White House. We therefore need to prepare for true economic democracy. And economic democracy builds on living economies. They grow from the grassroots up. And you have a very vibrant grassroots in America. And I worked a lot with the cities. When Trump walked away from from Paris, the cities got together and they actually made commitments that would have countered, totally, undone his damage. And they're working on this. So we shouldn't ignore the multiple levels of democracy, the multiple forms of democracy. I call the deep democracy earth democracy, because it's not enough to have democracy for humans. Even if it includes all colors, all genders, it includes everyone, we won't have true democracy if we don't have democracy for the earth and for all her beings. And the minute we overcome anthropocentrism, we will suddenly realize we can overcome racism, we can overcome patriarchy, we can overcome class inequality, because when we look at ourselves as humanity rising through earth beings, we suddenly find there is enough on the earth to share. We don't have to be put into insecurity and fear of scarcity. We've got to shift to a mind of abundance. And it's that mind that is being blocked. And it's that mind we have to open up.
Thank you. Thank you. Charles.
Yeah. So let me just say, one of Trump's most recent decisions was to open the Tongass National Forest to logging, which is just horrendous. And I fervently hope that that kind of damage will at least slow down under President Biden or President Harris. So neither of us is saying that elections are unimportant or that there's no difference between the two parties. However, when all of our democratic energy is concentrated in elections and in the issues that are constituted by the elections, what we are offered as here's what is important to decide upon, then we ignore everything else. And that hijack of our democratic impulses allows the system to continue operating as it has been for decades. And so part of this hysteria of that generates the hate and the polarization like what you said about Trump and Hitler, like that, I think is part of it, because Trump is no Hitler, not because he has a pure heart, but because he is way less competent than Hitler was. He gets into office, he surrounds himself with uh, enemies, basically, who immediately start sabotaging his administration. He's completely incompetent as an administrator, and so there he's. Matt Taibbi writes really well about this. There he ends up, on the sofa watching Fox News, nursing his resentments, tweeting them out at night. He doesn't have. The man is not a capable dictator, but the disaffection and the alienation of a vast segment of the American people is so strong that they worship him anyway, and make them into this savior who's playing 4D chess against the deep state. It's wishful thinking. It's hero projection. It's the sublimation of their own desire to express their greatness. It's a delusion, but that is. The situation is so bad right now that tens of millions of people, like, that delusion is better than the powerlessness and despair and nihilism that is waiting for them as an alternative. So, yeah. So as far as what I also want to add to what Vandana was saying about from the perspective of the rest of the world, and actually I would say for most of this country, not much is going to change no matter who wins. Even if you're talking about African Americans, people of color, immigrants, yeah, like the policy that Trump tried out early on of intimidating potential migrants by separating them from their children, like that hard edge, maybe that is going to soften. But the conditions that generate endless migration, which is the impoverishment, ecological and financial, of other countries through neoliberal extraction, that's not going to change. The destruction of agriculture, of traditional agriculture all around the world at the behest of Monsanto and the big ag companies, that's not going to change. That's not only happening under Republicans. Obama, I mean, if you look at the history of the demonization of Russia, the coup in the Ukraine, a lot of that is because Russia booted out GMOs from their country. Like, how many people know that Russia as a nation is moving toward a fully organic agricultural system? And Ukraine, as soon as the coup happens in Ukraine, then they welcome Monsanto back in. Like, there's this layer that we are not seeing that is fully endorsed by Democrats and Republicans alike that needs our attention. So, yeah, and as far as, so yeah, like Donald Trump is, oh yes, you asked this question about does history make the man, or does the man make the history? It's interesting, I've been rereading Tolstoy, War and Peace. He very much takes the view that leaders are mere channels of larger historical forces. And my experience bears this out. I think leaders have a certain leeway that they can operate in, but by and large, if they want to do something too radical, they don't feel free to do that. They're like, well, I would like to, like, I've had these conversations with parliamentarians and stuff. And like, well, Charles, I agree with everything you say, but I can't do that because what about the opposition party? What about the rank and file? What about the lobbyists? What about the international financial markets, which will destroy our currency if we deviate too far from austerity? Like, they don't feel like they are free. They feel that they are puppets of larger forces, and they're right. And in a way, the conspiracy theories, the QAnon, all that kind of stuff that posits a new world order that's secretly pulling the strings from behind the scenes, there is a truth inside of that myth, which is that, in fact, our leaders are not actually in charge. So where does that leave us? not in a place of powerlessness, but in a place actually of recognizing where power really lies. And ultimately, it lies in the stories, the myths, the narratives underneath our systems, and in the state of being that we occupy as part of that. And so here that takes us back to reclaiming democracy as starting, from our relationships, from our communities, and not like, even like this whole thing about Donald Trump being a puppet of a foreign power who's seeking to destroy America. Like, really, is that the way we're going to understand the world, as a contest among competing great powers that are fundamentally at war with each other? Like, what does that narrative serve? It serves a new Cold War. It serves the military industrial complex. It serves the basic psychic template of us versus them, which itself is a symptom of the dissolution of community, that where and the cutting off of our connections to place, to land, to traditional ways of life that told us who we were in our relationships. When these relationships are destroyed, as they are by a growth-dependent economy that converts relationships into monetized transactions, that divorces us from the beings around us, from the soil, from the economic relationships by which we take care of each other, then we no longer have an identity. We no longer know who we are. And fascism and cults and conspiracy theories have something to offer. They say, here's who you are. You define yourself by your hate. This is a symptom of a vast breakdown, a disintegration in belonging, place, and community.
Yeah, I think this is a profound insight, and this gives rise, I think, to the very important question of, what does democracy actually mean in a world of the 21st century in the 2020s? I mean, if you think about the US electoral process, it was generated about 250 years ago. If you look at most of the institutions in the world, they've been generated, the ones who've been enduring for some time, centuries, eons ago. And we're now caught up in the last, say, 50 years in a world that is spinning faster and faster in every conceivable dimension. We had someone on this Humanity Rising the other day that was saying that human knowledge is doubling every 12 and a half minutes. So here you have, in the last 4 years, the world has been shape-shifting in all kinds of ways. And yet the American people had to wait 4 years to deliver the verdict on Trump. So I think underneath what both of you are saying, it feels to me that the human journey is in our generation moving from an era of change to a change of eras, as it's been said, and that the entire identity of what it means to be human, given the technology that is now available, given the potential in every conceivable realm for realities that weren't even hardly imaginable 20 or 30 years ago, we're being forced to rethink just about everything. And obviously, for the purposes of this conversation, given the day in which we find ourselves, November 3rd, 2020, I'd love to have both of your comments on, if you had to define how democracy should now manifest itself knowing that the ballot box, which 150 years ago was sort of the whole thing, because the world was in a completely different place with understanding and knowledge and information, how would each of you, you had to define how democracy should be structured or how it should work right now in a way that empowers all of us, what would your vision be?
Jim, for us in India, given that we had a very deep freedom movement, and Gandhi had written this book while he was still in South Africa, while he was fighting against the British, called Hind Swaraj, or Home Rule. Now, Home Rule was the language in Hawaii and all over the world, self-rule, that true democracy really is as much power in the hands of people and communities and at the local level, especially on issues that are life and death matters. Issues of our water, issues of our food. And therefore, in all of these 50 years of my work in movements, the power of the local to say no to pollution, the power of the local to say you cannot log our forest, which is the first movement I was involved in, the Chipko movement, where women came out to hug the trees. That power to say no to injustice is a very vital part of democracy. And Gandhi had a beautiful word for it called satyagraha, the force of truth. But you can't say no to the unjust, the brute, the violence against the earth, the extractivism, unless you create the alternative, both of governance as well as economy. I think the trick that has been played is to put democracy into purely an electoral system and take away its soul, which is participation.
Exactly.
And participation in affairs that make a difference to life. Therefore, you've got to bring the economy back. And this becomes particularly important when the economy is being made invisible. See, when Ford exploited the workers would organize. They knew who's making the money from their exploitation. But I would love to see how many people can see big tech as the new dictators and enslavers. Yeah, they're so invisible. The digital slavery is so invisible. Not only is it invisible, it seduces you to become the slave. You volunteer to be enslaved. You volunteer to have your data mined. You volunteer. And I think one of the things that's happened with this lockdown is people are suddenly waking up to the surveillance. They're waking up, lovely book, Surveillance Capitalism. We really need to be looking much more that the economy that made these billionaires is a surveillance economy, and the economy being put in place for the future if we don't rise as human beings. I read the literature of these fellows and the dystopias they're thinking about. They really see human beings as deficient creatures compared to their machines. The machine is their measure and we are deficient. So for me, humanity rising, Jim, today is humanity reclaiming its humanity, its flesh and its blood and its love and its compassion and its solidarity and its togetherness. And I want to mention to those who are here, I will send you the list of courses we offer at the Earth University, and let's have a good partnership. But what democracy looks like, I wrote this book called Earth Democracy. And this year, all I'm doing is courses on this. And this is the rights of the earth and the rights of people in one continuum. And more recently, I've written Oneness versus 1%. It's just come out from Chelsea Green in the US. It is about the pre-COVID economy, but the epilogue of the US edition has the post-COVID add-on. I think at this point, democracy is about a determination to live, a determination to live fully, a determination to live with autonomy and freedom, but not in separation, in interconnectedness. These are the things that are at stake today for the future. Because if you read the junk on transhumanism, that we human beings have to be upgraded to get married to our computers, no, these are tools. We must use them with consciousness. They are not our masters. They're not our measure. And we are not deficient. We are potential of the highest expression of the beauty of this world. And let us make humanity rising, the 21st century democracy, Earth rising, Earth democracy, 21st century democracy.
Beautiful. I love it. And I want to talk with you about how Ubiquity and Earth University can partner to get these courses greater distribution, Vandana. I'll be in touch with you about that. Charles, what would be your vision of what constitutes democracy under current world circumstances, given everything you've said about the challenges?
I really love what Vandana was saying again. Yeah, I really love what Vandana was saying, that it starts at the local level, and that it's not just starts at the local level, but its soul is at the local level. You mentioned the ballot box and 150 years ago and how the ballot box seemed to work and now it doesn't. Actually, though, 150 years ago, politics was much more local. And the ballot box was part of, like, one of the most important political roles at that time was the precinct captain, somebody who was canvassing the neighborhood. And if you were a legislator, like, you had to go back and face your constituents because you lived among them and you were connected to them in multidimensional ways, multiple dimensions. Today, you can simply use scaled up data-driven systems of campaigning that don't require any relationships whatsoever. Politics has conformed to the data-driven broadcast model of communication that obliterates person-to-person person-to-person relationships. Now, it seemed for a while that social media was going to allow us to reclaim peer-to-peer relationships. But now we see how that has been hijacked by centralized power also, even to a greater degree than before. And now in the COVID era, the ideology that human life can be reduced to digital interaction has risen to a new height, where you're not supposed to protest against lockdown because you can still live your virtual life, purchase your things that get delivered to your door, have Zoom meetings instead of live meetings, even dance parties where everybody dances in front of their camera together and has a great time. And where every interaction is surveilled and possibly controlled. So I know people in the what's pejoratively called the anti-vax movement, but let's say vaccine skeptics, who they get deplatformed, they get shadow banned. Sometimes even their text messages are deleted and don't reach their destination, or their Facebook messages. So their communication with each other is governed by an external power. So this fundamental right of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, is now in the hands of corporations, and really it's a corporate political complex. You really can't distinguish anymore between the state and the corporation. They're totally interwoven into each other. So democracy requires that first that we revalue, like we have to validate the things that cannot be reduced into data, that cannot be converted into quantity. The transhuman dream or nightmare, as Vandana and I would both put it, depends on a basic ideology of quantity that aspires to a future where everything is rationally optimized by computer algorithms that keep track of every person and everything. It's called the Internet of Things, to get everything into the world of data so that you can rationally administer the whole thing toward an ideal that is also measurable. So the basic ideology is that there is nothing that cannot be measured, and that everything important can be measured. And it's this is a type of reductionism that has deep scientific roots, the reduction of life to quantity. Economics is part of that ideology because it's the reduction of life to money, which is in economic ideology, it's the reduction of happiness to money. It's the measure of utility, as it's called in economics. So this is a huge ideology that encompasses economics, technology, governance, and democracy is really a reclamation of humanity, as Vandana was saying. This is what humanity rising is. It's to reclaim the qualitative, it's to reclaim the human, it's to reclaim the relational. It's to come back into community, into relationship, into the things that are not mediated by digits. And I hope that even though this meeting is mediated by digits, that something of that striving and that yearning is visible through it. Because again, this is what Vandana was saying, that the technology of quantity is meant to be a tool, not to take over our humanity, but it's meant to be a tool among many other tools, especially those that are not technologies of quantity, but are technologies of energy, technologies of relationship, technologies of life, of plants, of water, of the sacred. You can't talk about democracy without going down to that level.
Yeah. Well, this has been brilliant, everyone. I think what Vandana and Charles just said is in some ways sort of the bottom line when we talk about democracy in our time. And I want to just summarize this as we bring things to a close. I think what Charles just said is very profound, that democracy in a fundamental sense is reclaiming the qualitative nature of our humanity and ceasing to be quantified, commodified, commercialized products, as Vandana was describing a bit ago, but reclaiming the basic categories of our humanity and living them authentically. And I think that leads to what Vandana said, which is of equal profundity to me. And that is, democracy in our time has to be earth democracy, because underlying all of our activities, all of our beliefs, all of our ideologies are narratives, mythologies that undergird who we think we are. And I think one thing that hasn't, been touched on here, but the contribution of science. We've been living in a worldview for centuries now, starting with the Enlightenment, that the earth is inert, that matter is meaningless, that evolution is governed by randomness and chance, and that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. And nothing matters because there's no meaning in the universe. And guess what? We treat ourselves and each other and the planet in that spirit. And I think the reclaiming of humanity rising, the reclaiming of the qualitative categories, epistemological, phenomenological categories of our humanities, how we know who we are and what we are, is based on our story that we tell ourselves. And I think the most radical democratization that I'm feeling coming out of this conversation, which has been brilliant and nuanced, I thank you, is that if we could all embrace the story that we are Earth, we are Earth, we are the environment, we are nature. This conversation has been the Earth talking amongst itself. And we began to fashion the sinews of governance out of this emerging story. It would be a beautiful, beautiful impulse that has been going on long before us, but in our generation, given the critical challenges of our time, we have to embrace in a particularly important way. And so I deeply thank both of you for the sagaciousness with which you've honored this important milestone by bringing to our attention that it's way bigger than Biden and Trump, way bigger and more complex. And in the end, the failures that we're seeing all around us are failures in our own ability to embrace ourselves for who we most truly are. And that is Earth. There's where democracy begins and where it ends, from dust to dust. So thank you. Thank you very,
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful.
Just 1 minute each, just a quick final word, starting with you, Charles, and then Vandana. Just give us a final.
I just want to express my appreciation for you hosting this conversation. And in a time when almost everything is filtered through, okay, which side are you on? Which side does this serve? It's so good to even hear your response to what we've been saying, to relax those categories and look at something from an outside perspective. That gives me hope. So thank you for offering that way of holding us.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Vandana.
Well, you put it so beautifully, Jim. Here, we are Earth. And the minute we realize we are Earth, then all this sense of being powerless turns into what can we do to be the Earth and take care of her and love her? And then there is nothing like a disposable person. There's nothing like useless hands. And we immediately get the true regenerative economy going. That is the living economy. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. By the way, there's an after chat session. Please check the chat box for the conversation. I'm sure it'll be very, very animated. Charles, Vandana, you're welcome to stay.
I won't be able to stay, Jim, much as I'd have liked to.
We'll see everyone on the other side. And then tomorrow, everyone, which is election +1, we're having Joe Jaworski and Rianne Eisler. Joe Jaworski, who wrote the very famous book on synchronicity and really brought that language into the public conversation, and has worked with Otto Sharma and Adam Kahane and many others on the U process and U theory, coming out of MIT, a very wise man whose father was the special prosecutor that helped bring Richard Nixon down in the 1970s. So he has a very sensitive political vantage point. And then Riane Eisler, one of the great public intellectuals of our time, the author of The Chalice and the Blade, who's been looking at the culture of political culture from the point of view of thousands of years of patriarchy and the massive transposition of values that is now underway as patriarchy gives rise to what she calls partnership. That's another piece of the overall global drama that is being played out in the microcosm of the US election. So that's tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. Central European Time. But Charles and Vandana and Shelly, thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Just
you.
brilliant, 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 brilliant. Be well, everyone. We'll see you
Bye.
tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.